Joaquim for this moment.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for showing up on the second day of the conference here. My name is Duncan Yoon. I'm moderating this session. I'm going to try something since this is a panel on translation, so just bear with me here. Welcome to the session between the lines, between the worlds, the ghost and the translation.
Bem-vindo à sessão entre as linhas entre os mundos, o fantasma e a tradução.
How was that? Did that work? Yeah, Brazilian. Okay, Brazilian. There we go. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was also going to say Brazilian, but I was going to say it in a different tone, but also like my family is Brazilian, and so I was going to say more enthusiastically that was Brazilian, rather than with a certain note of disappointment I detected in Joaquim's voice.
Okay,
resignation, maybe.
Well, I was gonna read your or have it translate your bio into Portuguese, but since it's Brazilian Portuguese, I'll just read it. Yeah. All right. Here we go.
Say it's a Portuguese with sugar.
There we go.
Brazilian Portuguese.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel's speakers. Joaquim Arena from Cape Verde. Born in 1964, Joaquim is a Cape Verdean Portuguese writer and journalist. A lawyer by training, he dedicated himself to literature. He also served as the cultural advisor to the president of Cape Verde. He has published 3 novels, A Beacon in the Desert, The Truth About Chindoluz, and Where the Turtles Fly, Under Our Skin, his first full-length work of nonfiction, and his first book to be translated into English.
There are more novels. I have more novels than 3. That's okay.
Os palestrantes de hoje, Joaquim Arena de Cabo Verde, nascido em 1964. Joaquim é escritor português cape-verdiano e jornalista, advogado ao treinamento que ele se dedicou à literatura aqui também e serviu como conselheiro cultural para o presidente de Cape Verde, seu primeiro livro publicado em inglês.
Okay. She's not charismatic, is she? I have to say.
It's too mechanic.
Yeah.
Not enough sugar,
well,
huh?
But just not like. I'm not enthused about this otherwise very exciting man in that description.
What are some of the other works, novels that you wanted to mention?
I have a novel, not in English yet, Syriac and Mr. Childs, and I had I think one of the most interesting prizes in Portuguese literature, which is Oceanos, Prêmio Oceano. So, but we are going to talk about the Under Our Skin, which is in English. I think that's enough.
Okay. All right. So I will now switch over to introducing our second panelist of the day, Daniel Hahn from the United Kingdom. Daniel is a writer, editor, and translator with around 100 books to his name. He translates mostly literary fiction from Portuguese, Spanish, and French, encompassing fiction, children's books, and a number of nonfiction books. His work has won him the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, the International Dublin Literary Award, and the Blue Peter Award, among others. He is on the board of a number of organizations that work with literature, translation, and free speech. So I wanted to start the session with the question, which is part of the title. I did this in the last session, but I thought that it worked really well, and I want to try to see if I can say it in both English and Swahili. Now, it's interesting, when I did this earlier, the Portuguese had a voice as robotic as it was that set it up, but the Swahili did not yet. So we can talk a bit about how these sorts of, the barriers or the frontiers of translation and these sorts of things. So my first question to our panelists is, what do you consider to be the ghost in the translation? And in Swahili, I'm going to butcher this, unanona nini kuwa ghost katika tafsiri. I don't know if that works. Yeah, there
we go. It's a really interesting question, and one way of thinking about it is that's an interesting way of describing the translator. who is the human person. This is a human ghost rather than one of those ghosts which we should talk about, which that is a sort of presence in the translation, but is also not completely embodied. It's not completely there. It's not necessarily something that we're thinking about or aware of. That there is always this other presence. On the one hand, when I'm asking you to read a translation of mine, I want you to feel like you're reading something that is just you and whoever the writer is you're communing with, as it were. I was talking about one of my writers this morning, José Eduardo Agualusa, who I've mentioned on the stage before, who was supposed to be at the festival. And in one sense, when you're reading him in English, I want you to feel like it's just the two of you. Like there's this Angolan writer who's telling you a story, and somehow, without having to think about it too much, even if you don't know Portuguese, you kind of, we're going to pretend you speak Portuguese. But this is going to sound more sinister than I mean it, but I'm always there. Just started that sentence thinking, there must be a less creepy way of saying that. But the translator is in fact always there. The translator is kind of behind all of those words, is behind all of those choices, and is a presence that determines quite a lot of the experience you have as a reader. So that is going to be my slightly egotistical answer. I am the ghost in the translation. That was not a good answer.
But is it a friendly ghost or is it a haunting ghost?
It's trying to be benign. I'm not sure it always ends up that way. It's trying to be. I am trying to be enabling and hospitable, which are two things I think translation is about. But I think it is a really strange thing. You have as a reader a strange experience of sort of knowing in the abstract that there is someone who is between you and the story, between you and I don't really want to use it, but like the real voice, the original or whatever you want to call it. But there is always something, there is always a kind of shimmer of something else, which is a hopefully human kind of, the sort of wash that comes from reading through someone else's sensibility and someone else's idiolect and someone else's, what they notice and value in the thing that they are reading.
Joaquim?
Well, I'm a writer. He's a writer too. Huh? He's both writer, writer and a translator. In my case, if my first fear is if my translator turns into not a ghost but a monster and it kills my book or my story. Of course, it doesn't happen like that. But when we have our book translated into a language we can't read, like Chinese or Serbo-Croat, just to give you two examples. And if the translator doesn't send me an email with some notes and some questions, I get worried. So it happened. It happened with my book translated to Chinese, into Mandarin. I never got an email. I never got nothing from this translator. So the book came out. I can't tell you whether the translation is good or not. And I don't bother to ask some Chinese speaker to read my book and to tell me, well, this is very strange, but it happens. But if my book is into languages in which I can read, like English, French, Italian, or Spanish, well, I can go through some pages just to, I'm not going through the whole book. But if I read a couple of pages, if it sounds good, or well, I'll be fine. So this is always, the doubts writers have. In my case, I do have. For instance, I come from a country, a culture. We have two languages. We have the official language, which is Portuguese, and we have Creole, so mother tongue, the language we learn and the family, the house, and for friends, and okay. And sometimes we write some words in Creole. We put some Creole words in in a Portuguese text, and this could be one of the reasons my translator should send me. And you might ask him, "What? How can we translate this into this or that language?" So, and when I don't get this email, I get worried, much more worried, twice of, because it brings me some doubts, and I prefer not to think about this. And on the other hand, when I had my first book translated into Spanish, which I can read, which is very close to Portuguese, I wrote something like a character would say, "Great," in Portuguese, "fantástico," and it came in Spanish, "Oh, esto está de puta madre." Oh God. I was shocked because we don't use this in Portuguese, and it sounds very hard in Portuguese culture because we don't use these words like in Spanish. And so I began to think, well, Joaquim, you better not read your translations because it will give you a different perspective. And so these are some of the experiences we as writers, we have when we try to read our book translated into different languages. So sometimes we have surprises like this. But anyway, it's not our book anymore. This is another question because it's a translator's book. Because to me, there are two books, my book and the book that came out in a different language, because it's a creative work. The translator does a creative work, so it's his book. It's my book, but at the same time, it's his book. So he's entitled to write these words if he thinks it works better in this language.
Just going to say something which might be reassuring. I don't know if it's. Let's find out. It might be reassuring. There are, as you would expect, a lot of hierarchies within publishing about how different languages are valued, how writers from different places are valued, how different kinds of stories are valued, and translation suffers from that, and translation is also implicated in that, and we can talk about it a bit. But one of the things that is also different is translators in different places have a different sense of essentially whether they are allowed to have access to the writer. If you're translated by someone who's translating into Mandarin, or indeed some Southern European languages or lots of other languages around the world, a translator might be told, don't bother the author. The author is very important, much more important than us. I, as someone who translates into English, always assume that my writers are available to me, which is a factor of lots of things. Partly my writers will often speak English, but also because this is how English has historically behaved in the world, as you know. So every translator I know who works into English assumes that we will track you down on Instagram if we need to, and you will answer our questions and send you drafts or whatever. But I have a friend who translates into Italian, for example, who translates some of, I think, the most exciting, has had an amazing 30-year career with some of the best English language writers, who has had almost no contact with any of them, because the assumption is Mr. McEwen is very busy, or Mr. whoever it is, and we don't bother them. And so actually, there may be reasons that to do with language politics and all sorts of things that will explain why Jethro, your very good English translator, assumed you would be there for him, and your translator in China thought, however much it would have been nice for them to be in touch with you. Something which because I've just written a book now which is going to be translated into a couple of languages, and I've done something which I am encouraging other people to do. I have told my publisher I want to know who's translating them, so I can write to the translator and just say, ignore what anyone else is telling you. This is where I am if you need me. I'm not going to bother you because I'm also being translated into languages I don't understand. But I know from friends who work in lots of different languages that the assumption is often that the translator is subservient and the language is subservient. And as a result, we're grateful to be working on your book, but I'm not going to presume to show up on Instagram and say, look at me now. Which is just to say, you probably have amazing translators in Chinese, but we might never know.
Well, I've always loved the work of a publisher and a translator because we know stories of publishers. They would tell their writers, you can't write that. We're going both into prison. We'll be prosecuted. This was years ago. And I love the idea of a translator that goes after his writer. Like, I don't know if you know Paulo Faria, the Portuguese. He translated Cormac McCarthy, which was an American writer. Well, not easy. So he went after him. He even went to the United States. He's a friend of mine. He was telling me he was translating Satri, one of his best books. And they exchanged many letters, but he did go to the United States and he had meetings with Cormac McCarthy. So this is something very romantic around literature, but I love it. I like it. It's a kind of a liaison that I hope some translators come to see me. But yes, nowadays I think translators are having their place, even their names on the cover, which is something new that didn't exist some time ago. Translators would work in the shadows, but they would bring us international literature. But we have national literature, which is what we do, but there is international literature. We count on them for this universal or this world of literature, because we writers, we start as readers. There's no writer without a reader. We become writers after years and years of reading, and we don't read only in our own language. We read mostly, like me, we read mostly in foreign languages, in European language or whatever. So this is something. What he just mentioned, Jethro, my translator. I see them as kind of a how to say this, explorers of the languages, and because you have to love literature and to love language and to love the job of reading a book and then not only translate the words but the ideas. And so it's kind of it's a hard job. I never did it. I've never done it, and I have this idea that they have to, to try to find in their language what the author means, and this is not easy, and it takes us to the IA that we are. Maybe you're going to talk, and which is an interesting subject. Whether we can trust, or whether we will keep on having these translators doing their job, which is a creative job, as I said before.
Yeah, I wanna shelve that for a little bit later. I started out with it. I want to come back to it. But what I thought was interesting in what you were saying about reading and translating. I mean, I've always thought personally. I'm an academic. I write books about books. And I do my own sorts of translations, but they're not as systematic as like a full novel or something. That's more of a passage of something that maybe I haven't seen in the English that I'm working in. But I've always thought that translation was the closest form of reading. And Daniel, on the blog Asymptote, you wrote this amazing quote that I want to hear you sort of extemporantize on. He said, translation is all failure because it's never perfect. And it is all also simultaneously a triumph because however imperfectly something living has been created out of the most unlikely circumstances.
That's quite good.
Yeah. I thought so. That's why I picked it.
This was a while ago. I did a series of blog posts for Asymptote, many years ago. So we're slightly worried where someone quotes something. Maybe I just disagree terribly. But I think that's true. I think that I think it's easy to think about translation in terms of what's wrong with it. I think, if I ask you to kind of complete the phrase, blank in translation, like 3/4 of the people in the room are going lost in translation. Like there's this kind of idea that you measure it in relation to the ways in which it falls short of this perfect thing. And the way I think of it much more is, I think there are two ways. One is thinking the alternative to an imperfect translation is not a perfect translation. The alternative is nothing. The alternative is you don't get to read Tolstoy. It's never going to be perfect if we define perfection as something that is exactly the same as Russian. The problem is Russian is not English, and English is not Swahili, and Swahili is not Portuguese. And so the translator is going to be making something out of tools that are different, out of materials even that are different. One of the metaphors, translators always talk in metaphors. We explain translation, say it's a little bit like building a bridge, or it's like making a sandwich, or it's like everything. But one of the ones I like is to think of it as a sort of performative thing, as something that is faithful, which is an annoying word, but let's go with that. But also expressive and individual, in the same way that if you ask 10 actors to give you a speech from Hamlet, they might all be Hamlet. They will all be using the same words. They will all be maybe striving for something comparable, but they'll be expressing it in different ways. None of them will be, as it were, the perfect Hamlet, but also there isn't such a thing. You can't have everything all in one go. And so what you're getting is one person who is reading this thing and re-expressing this thing through their own sensibility, through their own idiolect, the way they themselves use language. And I think the idea that I would go, well, I'm never going to go and see a performance of, I'm a big Shakespeare fan and I will mention him a lot, but the idea that I'll never go and see a Shakespeare play performed because performance will inevitably be only one actor, only one voice, only one person's reading of something, would be a very peculiar way to be enthusiastic about this thing that I love. And so a translation, I think, is always going to be different. I'm not going to say lost exactly, but it's going to be different because I'm removing 50,000 words of this novel and putting in 50,000 new words. And so we've lost 50,000 words of Portuguese and gained 50,000 words of English, and all the things that I think are important will still be there. But I think that is not just, better than nothing. I think it can be an exciting and magnificent experience for a reader.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, Joaquim, even if you're writing, is there a perfect word, or is the idea even coming across imperfectly as you're writing, or is there a tension between finding that perfect word or that perfect phrase and maybe just an approximation of the idea that you really want to express?
Oh, perfect word. Le mot juste, like Flaubert used to say. Well, I don't know. I don't worry. Maybe when I'm reviewing my first draft, perhaps I might be worried about that. But I keep on writing. I write, and I don't have much. What I would like to do is I would like to have two different readers. Imagine. A reader, an English reader and an Italian reader to my same book, and to tell me what they think of my story. So this is something I had never had in my life, my experience as a writer. But this is something, now we're talking about translation, because we are in a different different places, as a writer and as a translator. So, as a writer, there is not much to say about I don't, as I say, I don't worry too much about my books, how they are, whether they've been translated in the best way, or if the translation could be better. You see, I'd rather talk to readers and to get to the experience of their reading of my books. And I think it's the best way for me to know whether the translation is good or not. Because as writers, there's not much we can say about this subject, you see. We hope the books to be translated to many languages. But then it's something that's very far away from beyond us, you know. All the translations, okay, we can keep some books at home just to show friends that we have books translated. But okay, we can, if we can get some money out of that, it's okay. But it's a different world. You know, it has nothing to do with writing. You know, what I like to do is to write and to do some researching a subject, and come up with this story, these characters. And you know, the thing about translation is just maybe in a group of translators, it might be something, a subject to be discussed. But as a writer, I can be just a witness, because it's done. I can't do anything, and I hope the readers in this language might like it, or might want to talk to me about. Then I can tell you, well, this is good, but it's an experience. I need the other side. You see, like all writers, we need the reader to tell us something, and that's what I can say.
I should say that as someone who's on the other side and therefore dealing with writers, not all writers are as relaxed. I don't know how to put this, since this is being recorded. Some writers are control freaks, and some writers are less control freaks. You seem to be one of the ones who is less a control freak. There are many writers who describe exactly your experience, that, you know, I'll help if the translator asks me. I'm glad it's happening. I'm curious to know, like, if the reader said, I thought your book was really funny. If your book was originally really funny, this is a win. But I do have writers who will sit with me and literally look at every sentence, which is one of the blessings and also curses of working into English, which is a language that is widely spoken. Can I just, this is slightly parenthetical, but can I just come back to the thing your question, Duncan, about finding the exact word? This is a bit of a digression, but it's a story I love. I think the greatest of all Brazilian writers was a writer called Machado de Assis, who wrote at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And he was an Afro-Brazilian writer writing very early. Slavery was still legal in Brazil when he started writing. He was unusual in many ways, but he's also an extraordinary stylist, storyteller, incredibly inventive, stylistically inventive, and I think sort of the father of all the Brazilian writing that came afterwards in lots of ways. And I translated a little collection of his stories a few years ago, and it included a story called the canon in the sense of a priest rather than canon in the sense of a gun. And I don't know if you know this one. It's quite a little known one of his many stories. And in this story, a canon is writing a sermon. And he writes a sentence and he gets to the noun. And then he can't think of the perfect adjective. Like, he knows that the perfect adjective for this noun is there, but he can't think what it is. And the narrator kind of walks with us as the canon goes to the window and looks out of the window thinking. And then the narrator says, "Hup! Okay, we're now inside the canon's brain." Bear in mind, this is this is a late 19th century story. We're now inside the canon's brain. And the rest of the story is essentially a love story between a noun and an adjective who are trying to find each other. And there is the side of the brain, as we all know, at which nouns are made, and the side in which adjectives are made. And in between them, there is all this kind of clutter of nonsense that this guy has, crap this guy has in his brain. Old quotations and memories and just nonsense. And you have this noun who is kind of scrabbling through this rubbish, trying to find the perfect adjective. And he finds lots of adjectives who are very nice, but who are not like the one. And he's looking for the one. And eventually the narrator has a kind of imaginary interlocutor. The narrator says, and eventually they find each other. These two words who are in love, and they get together and they marry. And the interlocutor says, but do words really fall in love like that? And the narrator says yes. And the interlocutor says, and they marry? And the interlocutor says yes. And when they marry, that is what we call style. Wow. Which, apart from everything else, is, I think, the best description of literary style that I have ever read in my life. But I think as a way of thinking about finding this, and it's a thing that I recognize when I'm writing or when I'm translating, I know that there is, like, I know when it's there. I know when I've got to that perfect combination, that perfect ending of a sentence. I know when I've got exactly the right, I'm landing on just the right syllable. But sometimes it feels like you're, clambering around all kinds of nonsense to get there. Sorry, that is slightly tangential, but I love that story.
Is the feeling affective? Is it like in your gut?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, it's I think it's in the gut. I think, like for any writer, a lot of it happens by sort of it when you see it. I feel like, especially when I'm teaching translation, I talk as though it's just practical. Look, we have a long word, and then we have a monosyllable at the end, and then we stress that monosyllable, and so it slows down the reading.
We got an email from my American publisher saying that there were a couple of words that we had to change because politically incorrect. In one section, I was writing about my grandmother. My grandmother, she's a mixed-race person, and me and my brothers, we used to joke because she had a nose and she looked like an American Indian, an Apache. And I wrote it because there is a section in my book which is autobiographic. And so I got this email, me and my translator. We can't use Indian, a nose like an Apache Indian. We have to change it. And another section, I wrote that when I was a kid in Portugal, in Lisbon, we lived not far from a gypsy community. They would come into our neighborhood, so to play with us, young gypsy boys. And I had to take it out because I couldn't write the word gypsy. Okay, this is, as a writer, it doesn't, well, it has to do with translation, but of course it has not to do with the word my translator has chosen. It has to do with the politically correct side of my work. I mean, this happened in America. Of course, it doesn't happen in Africa or in Portugal or in Europe. I don't think we have to face this kind of censorship. But, well, now we are discussing translation. And sometimes a writer might have to change his, because the publisher says so, and because if you want your book to be published in this country, you have to follow the rules. So I think this is a new thing in last years. It happens a lot, censorship, especially in the United States. So I have one book published in the United States, and I have this, just a couple of examples. Of course, it's not good because it makes you change, and it's always troubling when you have to do this. I don't know if you've been through something like that before in your career.
I've dealt with this a lot because I am, as a translator, I'm normally dealing with a writer who's come from one culture and readers who are in a different culture, and there are always going to be frictions. I have a lot of writers who use the word censorship, as you did, to describe what's happening to them, which is not how I think about it at all. Because I can think of a couple of cases. I can think of one writer who was very adamant and didn't want to change anything and said, in a way that I do understand at least, the book is partly about, I'm trying to say this without saying who the writer is. I've translated one book that is substantially about prejudice, and it's important that specifically the language is supposed to shock people. You're supposed to be telling the truth about what prejudice looks like. And this is because there are characters who use language that I would never use, and indeed the author in his, the author now in his life would never use either. But we're trying to work out how to deploy some language which is often hateful and aggressive, but also use it, not pretend it isn't there, because actually the point of this book is to say something about, in this case, the experience of a writer's own experience of racist abuse and racist oppression. But I also have had some cases, I can think of one particular case where a publisher in the US wrote to the writer and said, have you noticed that we want to change these references to this character because we think that there's this one character who is of a different background from you, and there are all kinds of little cliches in the way that this character is being depicted. And the author was mortified because he hadn't noticed. And actually the author, I think, was very grateful to have someone who is in a publishing culture, but also a culture in which the conversation about race is very different in the US to the country where this writer is from. He was mortified and very glad that someone had said to him, you do realize that there are 3 mentions of this character. This is the only character whose physical attributes you are describing. This is the only character who has, as it were, a sort of phenotypical description. And actually the author, with a little bit of resistance to begin with, I think understood that there was something that he, not only this is going to change how the book works in America, this I think will change how he writes his books in his own language later. Because I think he learned something from that, from a discourse that in some ways is, I won't say more sophisticated, but in some ways at least is more demanding, rightfully demanding of people who have a platform. In his case, he has a newspaper column and whatever. And I think it's difficult, though. I do think I understand why writers have this sense. I mean, a writer you and I both know pushed back quite a lot when an American publisher said, this paragraph is just going to get you in trouble. It's going to make it harder to sell the book. It's going to be the only thing that people talk about in relation to the book. I don't think it will mean to the readers what you think it means when you're writing it. I'll just give one more, just really quick example. There's a Brazilian writer called Paulo Scott. I've translated 2 of his books. And he has a black father and a white mother, and he's very light-skinned, he presents white in Brazil. His brother presents as black, and the book is about a pair of brothers who have these very different experiences of how they're treated because of their perceived ethnicity. And the book in Portuguese is called Marrom e Amarelo, which means brown and yellow. And it's a book about race and about how people appear, about the kind of the phenotypes of people. And what these words mean in the book, and for this writer and for his character, is these are 2 people with lighter brown skin or darker brown skin. Those color words, those labels, read really differently in the English-speaking world, indeed in different parts of the English-speaking world. I have lots of South Asian friends who describe themselves as brown, and it means a really particular thing in the UK and in some parts of the US. The word yellow also doesn't mean anything like it's a pejorative word. It's a word we would never use in English, I think, for race. But we had to have quite a complicated conversation with his author where we said, the reason we're not calling this book as he wanted it to be called, Brown and Yellow, is not because you shouldn't be allowed to say the things you're saying. It's because what you think you're writing is not how I would read it in English. The whole context, the whole conversation, and the way people feel about it is so different. And often that is the conversation. It's not you're being censored. It's you do need to understand that you don't necessarily know the world you're writing into or the characters you're writing into.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this goes to your point about the reception of the reader and the connection and relationship you want to have with the reader. And when there's certain words that have different connotations in different cultures, they resonate differently with the readers. So I think there's something similar to what you both are getting at there. So I started this session off with a little AI translation, which maybe didn't sit too well with folks. But I want to come back to it as a kind of provocation here as a last question before we open it up to the audience. So what does translation become in the age of AI and instantaneous language transfer? What happens to the language? What happens to us when we're translated by the platform?
I mean, yes, it is. It is more my. It'll eventually be your problem. It'll be my problem before it's your problem. But like it'll come for you too. It's an incredibly important question and one that you have to ask and we have to talk about. But it's a very grim one. It's a very depressing one, I think. Just a few years ago, maybe not even, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, let's say. Most literary translators I know would have said there is a sort of exception that literary translation, at least, like we know that various AI tools, especially things that are getting better now, can do what you asked of it just then, which is to say it can grasp meaning, it can reconstruct that meaning in other language, even quite complex sentences. There's no reason why it can't do that. But literary translation is special, different. It requires different. It has different components which are not just meaning. And those other components are something which AI tools at this point can't do, or not necessarily interested in doing. I think things have changed a lot in the last year or so for two reasons. One of them is it's got better, and it's got better by obviously stealing the work of translators. And as you all know, these tools are trained on work that is the copyright of the writers and translators in this room and at this festival. There's just been mercifully one decent legal settlement in America because AI tools are trained on massive amounts of copyright material, other people's copyright material that is scraped from the internet and from pirate book sites and things. So it's been getting better is one thing that has changed through, theft and other stuff. But the other thing that I think has changed is people have been talking about like an assumption that it probably is going to be able to do everything. And talking about it like that has done quite a lot of damage, because I think now we've reached the point where a lot of people are assuming that it's a matter of time. And, it can't quite do what literary translators do, but like almost. And in a way, the thing that worries me about where we are with AI at the moment is not that it can yet do all of the bits of translation that I do. It's that either people don't know the difference, or people don't really care about the difference. Because if you imagine, like I'm a human person, and I therefore need food, and I need to pay a mortgage, and I need money for my job, and I take time. And if you can imagine a conversation quite soon, I think, with a publisher where they're going like, so we can get Danny to translate this book. We have to wait 6 months till he's free, and it'll cost £5,000 to do this big novel. Or we do this other thing, which is like, it's only 80%, but like, you'll have it in 15 minutes and it's free. And like maybe 80% is fine. And so I think what worries me is not quite that it's able to do, that any of the tools that I've sort of played around with can do the things that I think are interesting about translation. Because I think meaning is, in a way, the least interesting thing about what a translator has to grapple with. There is a million other things we can talk about. But I worry that, as I say, either people can't really tell the difference, which it's hard to be able to tell the difference unless you are comparing to the sophisticated things that a source text are doing, or where the difference is, where publishers are strapped for money and people are risk averse and people are anxious and people are in a hurry, whether the difference is a luxury. So I'm not as optimistic as I was recently. I will say, though, that one of the things that's interesting talking to my friends who are translators is obviously the capabilities of literary translation or any translation done by AI tools varies immensely depending on the language pair you're talking about, depending on how well resourced those are. I run a program to work with translators from South Asian languages, and there isn't yet one. I mean, there are a couple that are stuck together, but there isn't really any pair of even a South Asian language and English where the quality is worrying the translators I work with in any way. My friends who work with the languages I work with, and with French and with Mandarin, I think the threat is real now. Sorry.
Well, I began saying that my Mandarin translator never sent me an email. I don't know if AI will ever send me an email if one day we get to it. But well, I can give you an example from my book translated by Jethro. He read my Portuguese book, and we came to a section where I talk about these rice fields in southern Portugal where African slaves worked 200 years ago because they were fit. I mean, they were healthier than the Portuguese at the time. Rice fields means water, what means malaria. So they could be better workers than laborers than the Portuguese. So in order to translate it into English, Jethro just asked me if I wouldn't mind if he could put a footnote explaining and that what I was talking about was similar to rice fields in Louisiana. So it was helping the American readers to understand, the context of my story and why I was writing about these rice fields and what the rice fields meant to Portugal at that time. So it helped me a lot, and it helped the American readers to understand what I meant. Well, the question is, will AI ask the same question or propose the same or put this idea in front of me? I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not aware of all the potential of AI as a writer to trust or not. Of course, we cannot compare when we have somebody on the other side of the line or is talking to us, is asking us questions. It's the human side of it. Literary translation, of course, fiction, which is quite different. So I think the human side of it, this dialogue, this exchange of ideas, which brings us to a better translation, and trying to find in the other language the real words or the real picture to translate what the author wanted to say. I'd like to say I find it hard for a AI to do that, but I can't say because I'm not aware of the whole potential or what's coming next. in next years, what can we expect as writers? But I will, of course, I'll prefer to have the contact with my translator, and this is something, and I'm not, probably writers won't be so touched by it as translators. They might lose more money than we, because they live on that. But if some machine can do a good job, I don't know, but I have serious doubts about that.
Yeah.
It's writing too. I mean, it's and again, part of the problem, and I worked a lot with the Society of Authors in the UK, which is the Writers' Union, who are very concerned about the effect on writers as well as translators, illustrators, lots of different people. And one of the problems is not that there is any generative AI tool that will consistently produce work that is as good as your work, but if we are suddenly flooded with 100 million things that look like they are vaguely novels, which are cheaper than all the rest of us, but also making it very hard to find the good things. I think the thing that people worry about is being able to discover. That's why we're even talking about things like my bio in all of my work from now on says Daniel Hahn is a human translator. I use this word partly to make a point, but also because actually one of the things that we're seeing is people are using AI for writing as well as for translating and not being transparent about it. And you as a consumer should be able to choose, but also it should be easier to find the good stuff if you're not swimming in, I could go to one of a number of AI tools and produce 24 novels between now and the end of the day and put them on Amazon. I mean, they could just be there, which I do not feel would massively improve the quality of our cultural life. But it also doesn't make it any easier for the people who are spending a year writing a novel that I am interested in because it's by a person. That's why I want to read it.
So I would love to hear what the readers might think about these sorts of questions. Yes.
Okay, so I think it's the Kenyan writer and editor Billy Kahora who says he doesn't really believe that writers are competent enough to critique their own works. I sort of I'm provoked to think of it that way as well, and so during translation, beyond the fear of misrepresentation, I'm just like, okay, so what qualifies a writer to that control freaking? Or in other words, should there be limits to the involvement of writers into their translated works? And the second question is to you, Duncan. You say that you translate. And I'm thinking of language as perspective. So your translation from English to English, from fiction to academy, how is perspective playing into that? It's how do you think of perspective in the translations as well? But to my first,
As I say, I have a kind of spectrum of different kinds of involvement from writers in the decisions that are made about what the translation finally looks like. And often it comes down to, I almost always think I'm the person with the greatest competence in the language in which I write. I have a couple of writers who are basically bilingual with English and could write in English if they wanted to and choose not to. But for the most part, it comes down to me saying to a writer, A, you're going to have to trust me, and B, if you would like me to explain why I think this is a better representation of what you're saying, I'm happy to do this. So you might look at this, the last line of chapter 7 and say, this is not what I said, I want it to be different. This does not represent what I'm saying. And I sometimes have to say, okay, I'm going to explain to you. Maybe you will disagree, but the reason it's different is because yours was funny, yours was a joke. If I translated the meaning, which you would have recognized, I would have preserved something, but I would have lost the joke. And so what I've done is I've kept what I think is important. And you, as a writer, I hope will understand that my decision rather than your decision, my decision is actually, as it were, representing what you're trying to do better. So part of it, there is this conversation where I sometimes have to, not exactly justify myself, but explain like the thing that you might not have noticed as a writer. So you want it to be this way, I want it to be this way, but I'm not just being a delinquent. I have a reason which I think is in your interest for making this choice rather than that choice. And so part of it is there is a kind of conversation, and then there is a trust which comes from the writers I've worked with in some cases for nearly 20 years. You know, I've been doing this and had some writers I've been working with all the way through. But the other thing I think is that the places where I do sometimes give way. I mean, writers and I we've never had, not never, almost never had actual arguments. We have disagreements. There is one writer with whom I've had actual proper arguments, and a writer to whom I have sent the angriest emails I've ever sent in my life to anybody, including like closest friends, family, anything. But part of the issue is, on the one hand, I think I know better because we're working in a language that is the language that I've been hired to operate and to manipulate this language. But I also know that the writer is the person with the name on the cover. I might have mine as well, as Joaquim says, but mine will definitely be smaller. It will be representing this person. And I might say to a writer, I think we could even like lose one paragraph of chapter 6. I think it will be better without this paragraph. But if the writer says, no, this is what I want, even if I'm reasonably confident and give quite good reasons, I would never insist on that, because I also know that the writer is the person whose name is on the cover and whose reputation, if you like, is going to depend on how people receive this. So there is a little bit of a tussle sometimes, especially, as I say, if you translate into English, where I'm dealing mostly with writers who can read my translations. But I also can't think of, I've translated a lot of books. I can't think of any instance where we like haven't been able to, where we've reached kind of an impasse and haven't been able to agree at all. But there is one writer I've done half a dozen books with, and we are on much better terms now than we were when we started. We don't argue anymore.
Well, I don't get much involved with my translators. First of all, my publishers, they send me a small biography of, and I go and I do some research on the internet, and I see what books they have translated, from my language. And then we get to talk, and I get to see that most of them, they work with Portuguese or Brazilian writers, so which means that they have already experience, and I trust them, and I can't think of a translator that is doing a bad. There are bad translators, as in everywhere, in every kind of work. We can find good and bad, but no, I don't think we can. Somebody is going to spend so many months translating a book and to have a bad work at final. I don't think so. So I start like this. I trust, and we exchange even before you start working. We can talk or exchange some ideas, etc. And we might talk and we might exchange some messages through the process of translation. And well, that's the way it is. And besides my Chinese translator, well, as I said before, I really admire this job of translating. Because since I I started reading when I was a teenager, I had the idea that if I could read Russian writers and German writers, so it was due to this hard work to bring these writers into my language. So this is something that I always admired. So, and I can't think of a bad. Well, there used to be some bad translations in some Portuguese publishers like Europa America, etc., from the 70s. But nowadays, and then we can always have the Brazilians too, because we Cape Verdeans, we are between Portugal and Brazil, so we can have Brazilian authors being translated into English and Portuguese. But so to answer you, I don't get involved because there is this trust from the start.
And I guess since you asked me a question directly, I'll just respond quickly. As a scholar, I'm really privileged because this entire conversation I can put out on the page. I can talk about, oh, why was this word translated instead of this word? Or what was the politics of this translation? What was the print culture around it? What was the economy around it? What market was available? So for me, all of these conversations that sort of happen behind closed doors are something that I can kind of render explicit as I go through something. So, yeah, question.
So I have a follow-up question to Dan, kind of trying to understand where do you draw the line? Because you've given an example where, for me, it was very clear, and I think maybe because it's more concrete, we can understand when you talked about brown and yellow. You're trying to translate it into the same meaning that you could have apprehended in another language. But prior to that, you gave an example where the publisher found 3, what I understood as flaws of the book in itself. And the idea was that you would remove those flaws. But is that a matter of translating the book, or are you improving the actual flaws that exist in the original? And then the other example was just that you just gave was, I think the book would be better without that paragraph. So I'm trying to understand a little bit of where does translation stop and where does it actually become about improving the work that is actually there in the original language? Yeah.
Thank you. It's a really interesting question, and the short-ish answer, because we haven't got much time, is that one of the reasons I think this comes into play is not just because cultures are different and cultural conversations are different. It's because editorial practices are different. I will usually be translating a book almost from any country I work because I have 3 big colonial languages. I work potentially with writers from 35 countries. Almost all of those countries are countries where writers don't get a really rigorous editorial kind of contribution, let's say, as part of their publishing process. When you write a novel to publish in the English-speaking markets, certainly if you're publishing in the kind of big dominant capitalist New York, London type markets, usually what will happen is you will send your novel to your editor, who will like it or lie about how much they like it, but they will suggest things that are not just, there is a spelling mistake on page 7. You will often have a conversation which involves, have you thought about maybe swapping these 2 things around? This is really great. The subplot is really interesting, but actually the subplot dominates at just the point at which we want to be really invested in the main character. You will have often structural conversations. And almost none of the writers I've worked with have that experience when they're publishing in their original language. And there are various reasons for that, and part of it has to do with how we think about authorship. I work with a lot of writers who work in cultures where there is this idea of like the individual creative genius, and no one other than the writer could presume to suggest that the book could be in any way improved, which I'm sure is true about Joaquim's books. But I think one of the things that then happens when a book is translated is sometimes you actually get an opportunity for a writer to get a kind of editorial attention that they didn't get to begin with. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. One of them is a writer who's been at this festival, Kalafe Palanga, who some of you will have seen before, and whom I think Joaquim knows. He's a brilliant Angolan writer, and I translated his debut novel called, in English, White Skin Dance 2. And one of the things that happened when it was translated into English and published in the UK was the publisher said to him, of course, this is up to you, but here are a few things to think about, to do with structure, to do with pace, to do with how much information you're giving. And it's often difficult to figure out the tone in which to have this conversation, because you also don't want, particularly when there is a really kind of obvious power imbalance, like a publisher in London to say, we want you to adjust your novel to suit our tastes and our sensibilities. But Calaf was really excited, and he, it had been his debut novel. He published it a long time ago. No one had had this conversation with him, and he made a lot of changes. He wrote some new scenes. He moved things around, some of which he will describe as being done in order to, as it were, suit what the publisher wanted. And some of it was because he found out things that hadn't worked that he could do better. Just another really quick example, a Mexican writer I worked with, the editor of the book wrote to him and said, your book is wonderful, we love it, you're amazing, you're a genius, it's completely brilliant. However, on page such and such, I'd like to delete one paragraph. And there's a very simple reason, which is one of the many narrators is the main character's mother, and it's a really voicey, she's a really good character, and she's really dynamic. She never moves the plot forward. She just kind of comes in and comments and is very dynamic, and we love her. She's a great character. But at just this moment, when the novel is picking up a bit of pace, we're just getting invested in narrative. We're just getting invested in things that are happening. And will the main character escape from the gang who is chasing him, basically? Now is not the moment for you to show off how good you are at writing this amusing, slightly eccentric voice. And because it was explained in that way, it wasn't the editor saying, well, I like novels with more, I want you to write a car chase and a sex scene. It was explaining to the writer, actually, I think I understand what you're trying to do with this novel. Here is my experience reading it. You can ignore it. You can say, no, screw you, I want it to be exactly as I want it. But it might be a useful piece of intelligence for you. And the writer was delighted that someone pointed this out to him. And it made sense. It was not aggressive. It was not disrespectful. It was, this might be a useful thing for you to know. Sometimes as a translator, I'm involved in those conversations, and sometimes I'll be the person, because I also am the person who writes to my writers and say, you realize that you killed a character off in chapter 7 and he walked into a cafe in chapter 9. And no one has noticed this, despite the fact that 84 people have read this at your previous publishing house. And so there are some of those things which are kind of obvious. But it's often a conversation that involves the editor and the publishing house, and it's often a very collaborative and productive one. Like I say, there are challenges sometimes to how this is presented, because you don't want this to be a case of, we have this sense of like what the novel is supposed to be. And in my culture, novels are supposed to be spare and economical, and, this thing which is different from ours is therefore a thing that we want to change because it is more lush or more chaotic or more whatever. It has to not be that. It has to not be the imposing of a different view. But like any editorial process, what I want from an editor is someone to completely understand what I'm trying to do and then make it the best possible version of that thing. Not make it something else, not make it a thing with sex scenes and car chases if that's not what I'm writing, but make it the best possible version of what I'm doing. And sometimes, very occasionally, some writers, present company not accepted, benefit from other people. As you said, sometimes there comes a point when you are ready to give something to other people. And sometimes that only happens in translation 5 years after the novel is published, where some annoying person in London points out that they've killed off a character in chapter 7.
So I think, unfortunately, we are well over time. We are welcome to continue the conversation, after we've adjourned here. But thank you again for coming to the session. Please give our panelists a round of applause.